Paul, let's have a rebuttal. You are up.
Like Rain Man, Alex is a really good driver. Hey, got a question. How many people in the room drive? Hands up. Show of hands. How many of you say that you're better than average driving? Exactly. So it might shock you to know that, and this is a NHTSA statistic, and you've heard it, I'm sure, ad nauseum, everybody in this room. I gotta get my slides up here. Okay. You've heard this ad nauseum, but 94% of fatal crashes are a direct result of human error. And I use the word crash, not accident, because of that statistic.
An Apple guy. I'm not an Apple guy.
I'll fake my way through it. Hold on.
I'm an IBM guy.
Yeah, go for it. Thanks. So
Old school.
I'm hoping that I can convince the Human Driving Association to take ownership of that statistic and figure out what we can do to significantly reduce that. Thanks for bailing me out there, brother.
Thanks, Alex.
That one. There you go.
Edge case.
Perfect. You rock.
There you go.
Thanks, sir. Good man. All right, so I'm going to talk about where we are relative to Washington. Where is Washington on self-driving and smart driving? And it just kind of reminds me, this whole presentation kind of reminds me of what Winston Churchill said about Americans, and it's true in the case of self-driving policy and smart driving policy, is that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing right after they've exhausted every other possibility. And it's kind of where we are right now. And I want to sort of suggest as to what is driving some of the policy discussions that we're going to have. I'm going to talk a bit about what goes into making effective innovation policy generally, and then I'm going to get more specific. I'm going to refer to a publication that my organization, the Alliance for Transportation Innovation, put out in September of 2016 that outlined really kind of 8 key challenges and frankly where the policy should reside in terms of ownership across the United States government. And one of the reasons I want to bring that up is because Adam Jonas pointed out something really profound but didn't get a lot of attention. And that is that the Defense Department's been playing in autonomy for quite some time. And now the Department of Transportation, after DARPA Urban Challenge, is starting to play in it. And there are other agencies as well, Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communication Commission. All these things are stakeholders and are critical policymakers in enabling the next generation of smart transportation, and none of them talk to each other. And there's an important reason why I want to get into that. And then I'm going to talk about the federal policy evolution and exactly where we are today and why we are where we are today, key challenges and opportunities, and then I'm going to ask a question, who cares and does it really matter from a policy perspective. Effective innovation policy, and I've been at this game driving innovation policy in the federal government starting on Capitol Hill since 1989. I worked for the United States Senate for 7 years on the Senate Subcommittee on Oversight of Government Management, and I was staff director, but I was also the point person on innovation policy there. And it requires really painting the picture of the future. What's the future look like? There needs to be consensus among policymakers as to what that looks like. There needs to be some level of agreement so that you can drive legislation, you can convince colleagues, you can get people focused on what needs to change in terms of law, regulation, policy, practice, and even culture. And it's something that we don't necessarily talk about that much. And then you have to develop, from a policy perspective, from a legislative perspective, an actionable plan that actually meets ideas with investment. You actually have to put either people or dollars behind what it is that you're looking to accomplish. So I'm going to blow through these really quickly. When we put out this National Strategic Framework to advance self-driving, and I'm not going to read these to you, you can just read them yourself and absorb them. We really focus the ownership in the executive office of the president for this particular mission because we recognize the fact that there are a lot of entities across government that need to play into this that have invested a lot of money. And frankly, we wouldn't be sitting here today having this summit if it wasn't for the DARPA Urban Challenge, right? And the increase in automation, and that comes out of the Defense Department. And just so you know his background, after I left Capitol Hill, I worked as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and I was the Deputy Chief Information Officer of the Defense Department, where I was responsible for a lot of cross-service and defense agency communications, command control communications, and intelligence. Read into that. It's all about data. It's all about comms, and it's about analytics. And that's what I did after I got out. So I'm really familiar with what's going on in the Defense Department even today. I've stayed in touch with that. And then afterwards, I became the head of research and innovative technology at the United States Department of Transportation. And it was readily apparent that those two worlds never talk to each other. So when we developed this, my background and knowledge and network of people that are really wise about how you really implement innovation policy across government strongly suggested that we put ownership for this in the Office of Science and Technology Policy within the Executive Office of the President, so we could pull in all those disparate stakeholders. Because right now what we've got is a transportation echo chamber that's not really getting us what we need to do, and they're not holistically looking at all of these key issues and what we need to do in order to win over public trust and address some of the big, hairy issues that we have to deal with more holistically, including insurance frameworks and including data policy, privacy policies, and so forth. This is very, very complicated. So let's take a look at the federal policy evolution. I threw our thing up there just because, well, I'm talking to you, so I get to put that on my slide. But there are lots of other publications out there that ENO's put together, TRB's put together. Everybody's got an opinion or a publication on self-driving, and I know, there are more and more books being written about this. But the reality is, this is an evolution, and we're in a very nascent spot. Capitol Hill really doesn't necessarily understand the issues at play here. And the reason why is because, and I'm going to share a little Washington, D.C. secret with you here, the number one objective of every congressional office on the planet is to raise money and get reelected. That's it. Policy is sort of, I don't want to suggest it's an afterthought, but they tend to pay attention to policies where they can meet, where they can identify people who have a stake in lobbying. And Mick Mulvaney, who is the head of the Office of Management and Budget, former congressman from South Carolina, some of you maybe remember, he spoke a very significant truth about 2 weeks ago, when he said, look, in my congressional office, we meet with the lobbyists who donate first. Well, you know what? Absolutely right. That's what happens. That's what congressional offices do. If you're a constituent, you might get, you're definitely going to get a meeting. You'll get the meet and greet and the normal stuff. But anybody else, if you're not giving them an economic reason to meet with you, they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. And the reason I bring this up, and I'm not going to read this stuff to you. You guys have eyes and can read and think yourself. And I'll explain the House legislation, Senate legislation in a minute, if for those of you who are curious. But the point I want to make is this conversation. When Adam put up his slide about autos 1.0 and autos 2.0, this conversation right here, this policy conversation, is being largely driven by autos 1.0. They're the ones who have the big lobbying shops. They're the ones who are laser focused on this issue. And you'll notice the pivot, and even the Senate bill is stuck right now. And one of the reasons it's stuck right now is because the auto industry has pivoted because the EPA emissions rules. So the lobbying force that would normally go into pushing this next generation of self-driving and smart vehicles is now focused on the CAFE issues and the fuel economy issues. But I will say this, the Coalition for Future Mobility was started by the Auto Alliance and global automakers. This is a good organization, and they've actually, ATI 21, my organization, was one of the first 5 members of it. It's since expanded so that the House and Senate, not to get into conference details and legislative process details, but the House and Senate have to confer on their differences, come up with a single bill, a single report that gets voted out of both houses of Congress so it can land on the president's desk and they can sign it. But in the Senate, 1 or 2 senators can really kind of hold up the whole process, and that's what you got going on there. So, okay, I managed to break this. So I want to talk about just the key challenges and opportunities, and really kind of getting some unified vision or some consensus on what's driving the future. And in this case, it's really advanced technologies. It's artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's data analytics. It's things that Congress doesn't understand and has a real tough time wrapping their heads around, and they're scared. frankly. They don't know where this is really going, but they know they need to be a part of it because the dollars are huge. They know that there are billions and billions of dollars being invested in enabling technologies because they're hearing from constituents. But they don't know what to do. They don't know how to go ahead. Nobody's really educating them in a holistic way except the traditional Auto 1.0 folks. And then occasionally they hear from the 2.0 folks, but frankly the 2.0 companies are more concerned with things like immigration policy, tax policy, and innovation policy, and not necessarily zeroed in on the more broader smart vehicle issue. And then you've got the transportation culture. And let me just say that having worked around it for the last decade or 12 years, they are a little cautious, to say the least, and rolling out the safety card all the time, but they're a little bit loath to change. And it's not meant to be a criticism, it's just the way it is. They sort of are still stovepiped, and all you got to do is take a look at like the V2V policy that, there's still folks out there who are still trying to push, DSRC communications in the intersections, and look at the technology that's at the intersection, and that will tell you that change is slow. In an era where you've got to have more robust communications, more robust connectivity, dynamic signal changing based on the ones and zeros, it's really difficult to get the ones and zeros moving. And in Washington, we're always burdened with something we call the silos of excellence, which were sort of reinforced at that listening session that I described to you. And it's a bit of an echo chamber. Not exactly open to a whole lot of outside voices or innovation policy. And I know, having been the RETA administrator for a while at USDOT, is that it's really hard to bring new thinking to the table, as evidenced by some efforts that I did trying to pull in folks from the defense community to talk to the DOT community, even a couple of years ago on cybersecurity issues, because very few people really have a good handle on defense in depth and cyber architectures as the intelligence community and the defense community. And I think there are things that both sides can learn from one another, and we need to figure out how to open up those channels of communication. Resources, and I'm going to say some things that maybe some of the transportation folks can't say, but we need people. You see the exemption, increase in exemptions. I have no bloody idea how NHTSA is going to be able to accommodate that workload, or even if they've got processes and people with the knowledge, skills, and abilities to know what they're looking at when they look at that data and that information that's coming out of the industry. And we need money. It's not you can't will the ends without willing the means. And there just needs to be a level of investment in this activity, whether it's at DOT or whether it's at EOP or whether it's in any of the other agencies. And this is why defense is so out in front on a lot of this stuff, because frankly they're investing in it. They're sinking money into it, into the capabilities. And then we got to just break down these jurisdictional stovepipes. So the big question that I want to ask you guys is, does this really matter? Because what you're looking at here is one of the 50,000 cans of Budweiser that then Auto, now Uber Freight, moved from Fort Collins, Colorado to Colorado Springs, 126 miles on the interstate. And yeah, they had an escort and blah, blah, blah. But you've got Embark right now who's moving refrigerators from El Paso to California. And then you've got them testing, you've got Starsky Robotics testing up and down Florida. The question is that, look, they did that without a whole lot of law, regulation, and policy. And yes, it was a pain in the ass for Embark to negotiate with all the different jurisdictions that they have to move their truck through to move for these refrigerators, but they were able to do it without the policy. So the question I guess I want to leave you with, and this is just rhetorical, just think through this, is that does it really matter? I mean, do we really need to be moving out on policy right now? And I'll channel my inner Kornhauser and say, look, the fact of the matter is there are very few vehicles out there on the market today that are truly self-driving and not on the market, but just even being tested. And that becomes a question. And then how do low-speed shuttles fit into all of this and the regulatory policy, which neither the House nor Senate legislation address. So we got a long way to go on policy is the point I want to leave you with. And there's room for opportunity, but you're going to have to engage. You got to engage in this conversation. You're going to have to engage in the language of political commerce that the Hill understands if you want to have a voice in this debate. That's it. Thanks.
Jim, where are you?
Well, there's just a big disconnect between the innovation cycle and the policy cycle, and I'm not sure it's ever going to be able to catch up. So, frankly, we're having some conversations at the OMB level with the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs about how do you create a more nimble, agile rulemaking process for the federal government. Because, you just look, for example, if you wanted to reform the federal, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards,
It's right next to you, be careful.
That's potentially a 10-year process, right? It's a long process, it's long, convoluted, and the innovation cycles just don't wait that long. So fundamentally, the system's got to change, and it's not just in the transportation space. You're looking at durable medical equipment, you're looking at drugs, you're looking at all kinds of environmental rules and regulations. Going through that rulemaking process isn't serving the 21st century public.